Good afternoon and welcome to the panel session on day 2 called Tomorrow's World, Its Risks, Opportunities and Choices for Europe. This is part 2, a follow-on from the earlier session with Federica Mogherini and Pierre Vimont and Jim Close. My name is David O'Sullivan. I'll be the moderator. I'm a former Secretary General of the European Commission and a former EU ambassador to Washington. And we have a very promising panel with us today. I'm not going to introduce them in great detail because their CVs are available, but we will have Florence Gaub, who joins us online, who's the Deputy Director for the EU Institute for Security Studies. We hope to be joined, but I think we have not yet technologically made the connection to Singapore, by James Crabtree, the Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. We have Hervé Delphin, who is Head of Strategic Policy Planning in my old service, the European External Action Service, and he's with us in the studio. And we have another former colleague of mine from the EU Commission, who's now also a colleague because I'm chairman of the governing board of the European Policy Centre, and he is joining us, Ricardo Borges de Castro, who joins us from the European Policy Centre, where he is Associate Director of Head of Europe in the World. And of course, we have, last but not least, forgive me, I've mislaid my paper here. We have, sorry, Kristi, I know I've mislaid the, yes, I don't have, here we are, forgive me. Kristi Raik, who's the director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute at the International Center for Defense and Security. Sorry for losing my place on the script there, Kristi. We're, to a certain extent, going back to the future, because we're going to begin by looking at how some of those predictions for global trends have turned out. We have a sort of midterm review. I always, when I was involved in ESPAS from one of the early days, and I'm delighted that the initiative which was taken by James Ellis when he was a member of Parliament and then afterwards has really blossomed into what has become quite a great success of interinstitutional cooperation. But one of the quotes I used to like to give was from Niels Bohr, the Danish physicist, who said, "Prediction is always hazardous, especially when it comes to the future." So we can see now, Florence is going to give us a midterm review of how some of those predictions have turned out and what we think may be new trends. So Florence will make this presentation for the first 10 or 12 minutes, and then we will have a panel discussion and proceed to the question and answer. So please, Florence, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. So for those of you who don't remember, I held the pen of the 2019 report, Global Trends to 2030. And pretty much with the pandemic, people started asking me, what would you change in that report? But the truth is that even in the first weeks after the report coming out, I already started thinking, oh, I would write that differently. And that's only normal because the future evolves all the time. So there is no way of getting it right in that sense. The future is basically always a construct we have in the present. And so I think the danger that there is to think, oh, I got it right or wrong, when really it was a roadmap to inform your decision-making in the present. That said, I think it was a very interesting endeavor to go back to the report from 2 years ago and see what, with number one, new data we can say about trends that we identified then. And of course, crucial events such as, of course, the pandemic, but also the election of Joe Biden, what they did to the trajectory. Now, the paper is available online, so I'm not going to tell you everything that's in it, but I think looking back, I found we were pretty accurate on quite a number of things. Certain developments are now happening faster than we thought, others are happening slower. This is a common problem in foresight, why we tend to be quite good at seeing things. We struggle with timing, when do we think things will happen? But of course, there's also new trends. Perhaps the first thing which we had to update, and that is largely the result of a new report by the IPCC. So we didn't get it wrong. We got it right given the circumstances, given the data that we had at the time. But fact is, we are warming faster, and we will be reaching 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial times in 2040. And we thought that would be 2050. So we lost 10 years in terms of future projection within 2 years of anticipation. That's quite dramatic. And of course, there is a trend in itself, which is that the IPCC's reports tend to become more and more pessimistic. So the next one, we can probably expect it to be equally pessimistic. I think something that's new, that's changed, we saw it coming in 2019, but I think it's extremely obvious now, is that there is a sense of urgency and emergency. So in 2019, the Oxford Dictionary voted for climate emergency to be the words of the year. And I think that's completely different. When we started working on the last report throughout 2018, climate change was indeed a problem, was seen as a problem, but I think it was not seen as the emergency that it is now. So that's, I think, the first thing to be said. The second thing is related to that, and that is the future of the energy market. We thought that, well, we know that energy needs will continue to increase. That has not changed. But what has changed is the way people, states get their energy. And here, there's a number of different things coming together, as you will see in the current energy crisis. One of them is there's this huge uncertainty. There's a huge cone of possibilities when it comes to the energy transition. We don't know how fast it will occur. So that in itself increases instability, but also weather plays a role because renewable energy relies partly on the weather. And because of climate change, we now have extreme weather events. And of course, the weather always has a degree of unpredictability. That instability in the energy market will remain with us for the foreseeable future. And that is, I think, a new insight. Another interesting development or a new, let's say, an update on a trend is demography. Now, you will already be tired to know, to hear again that that Africa is exploding, a word I have a huge issue with, and that Europe is shrinking, as if you were in the laundry somehow. But the fact is that even before the pandemic, the UN had to revise its projections. So the world is not growing as fast. We're still growing, but not as fast as previously thought. That is to do with declining fertility, even in Africa. And of course, COVID made that worse in the sense that, or better, depending on where you're standing on the spectrum, that people are having less babies because of the pandemic. Now, that is a development that, of course, doesn't concern just us. We now know that, for instance, we think by 2066, the population of China will be halved. So, you know, the whole shrinking narrative is something that applies to us, applies also to Russia, to China, and to some extent also to the United States. So that is a trend that is occurring a little differently than we originally thought. Another interesting insight is economic growth. So, of course, COVID put a huge dent in it, but the overall trend is not turned around, which is that the world continues to grow in economic terms. And by 2024, we will be back to where we were before the pandemic. So that is, of course, that under the condition that vaccination continues, that things can resume in the same way as before, etc. But there are some bad news here. And of course, you know, we're sitting in Europe and we were lucky enough to have all these fiscal benefits and assistance by the states. But elsewhere, this was not the case. And so overall, we lost 7 years in terms of poverty reductions. We'll reach our original goal 7 years later. And while everywhere else, economic activity is resuming and poverty is being reduced again, this is not the case in Africa. So Africa, I'm afraid, is going to be the big loser in economic terms when it comes to the pandemic. The big winner, economically speaking, is China. In 2019, we thought it was going to reach biggest economic power in the world in 2030. Now it looks like that will be 2028. So a little faster here as well. Perhaps a quick word on trade. Contrary to what you hear in the press, reshoring, supply chains, deglobalization, take my word, it's not happening. In fact, what COVID did show is that deglobalization is almost not possible because we're so economically intertwined. This is also what makes the current situation completely different from the Cold War, when the two blocs were economically not nearly as closely together as they are now. So that in itself, I'll come to back in a second, will have interesting side effects when it comes to conflict and how we manage conflict when we're actually elsewhere pretty tightly knit together. So the whole thing of deglobalization, reshoring, beyond the rhetoric, it's not happening. Trade patterns are actually already exceeding pre-COVID numbers, at least for Europe. And then technology. Now, this is an interesting one because we always knew, Zoom wasn't born with the pandemic, but of course, Zoom and the likes of it are the big winners of the pandemic. So what is the difference? Well, the pandemic actually threw us over the barrier of resistance that we ourselves had, that employers had, that doctors had, that patients had, employees and so forth, against doing anything online. So in that sense, COVID actually did change the future significantly just because it changed our mindset. The technology was already there. So it's not, of course, not just online matters. It's also artificial intelligence that's been pushed forward, and robotics. In the US, orders for robots increased by 20% in the last year. And so overall, this means that we will transition faster into the new labor market, 7 years faster than originally thought. Here again, as in previous conversations, we have no clarity on how many jobs will be lost and how many jobs will be won. There are so many different studies out there, but what we can say safely is that we assume, or this tendency seems to indicate, that this will not happen abruptly and that more jobs will be created than will be lost. And then my last point on the trend review is geopolitics. Now, of course, this is where things have been moving where we expected. But perhaps I think the difference between now and 2019 is that we've given up any illusions facilitated by the election of Joe Biden, which made it easier for Europe to return to its transatlantic nest, if I may say so, and to choose, the alliance the cooperation, transatlantic cooperation, rather than having a third way. China's behavior during the pandemic and after was extremely assertive. Cyber attacks now also coming from China. Overall, they've increased by 25% over the last 2 years. We also have, of course, I mentioned earlier, the term connectivity wars, i.e., how do you express conflict when you're tightly connected with each other? Well, the use of migrants is not a novel way, but of course, very currently on our minds. We are likely to see more of that in the future. Now, I will stop here because I don't want you to know everything that's in the report. Just maybe read it and pick it up. I think what COVID changed, or what has changed, partly because of COVID, partly because of climate change, is how we relate to cities, to mobility, how we live, how we think about health, how we think about health as a collective rather than individual good. So I think there's a lot of interesting things happening. And so I think the update of the future was very necessary. Perhaps I will say one thing that's really new since the last report, and that is the use of foresight in itself. Of course, ESPAS preceded the last report, otherwise it wouldn't be there. But since then, we now have a commissioner for foresight. And this is not just the EU, this is everywhere. Even President Xi Jinping of China went on the record saying we need to have foresight capacities, we need to be able to anticipate such trends. And we are not alone in this. Why? Because every time things get a bit uncertain, foresight is having a heyday. So this is not the first time, but I hope that this time we managed to stay on for longer than last time when we disappeared as soon as things got calmer again. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Florence. That's a very rich review with a lot of interesting stuff there. I mean, the climate and the energy surprised me not too much. I must say I was very struck by the demographic pattern in China, the reduction by half by 2066. Maybe I was just not following things, but that was one thing which struck me. The dilemma of Africa, which of course is basically our neighborhood, and the fact that this is going to be a challenging environment, both climatically, demographically, and in terms of growth. And of course, I agree with you completely. I mean, you're confirming what my own instinct as a former trade negotiator, that talk of de-globalization in the aftermath of the pandemic was greatly overdone. And there is a degree of interdependence built into the system now, which it's almost impossible to reverse. Of course, you can have debates about certain industries or certain diversification of supply chains, resilience rather than pure efficiency, but I think that's an important trend. The other thing that struck me was when you talked about the changing nature of the job market. Because I think one of the things that's going to be common to the technology change and to the climate change is the social costs of transition. and how we manage that and how we deal with the political consequences of the potential social instability which this can generate. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. But look, I would now like to turn to the panel, and what I would like to do with their agreement is to ask each of the members of the panel in turn to pick up on what Florence has said, and maybe to also then pick up the second part of our title, which is, you know, what does this mean for Europe, and how should Europe, do we need to adjust policies? Are we already heading in the right direction to face some of these challenges? So I'll begin by asking Hervé, if I may, to tell us what's your takeaway from that report, and what's your conclusion for Europe?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Florence. And we always seem to be more intelligent with the benefit of insight, and we really think that we can best read the future by looking at the way things have unfolded. One thing that I know that Florence is also very much aware and always keep us reminded: don't think linear. It's not because we have seen these dynamics happening in the past years that you should extrapolate and it will continue the same. But it shows the importance of the fact of simply trying to assess the dynamics that happen, both, I would say, the trends, the intersection of dynamics, and how geopolitics play into the mix. Of course, turning to the second part of your question is, what does it mean for Europe? And I followed over 2 days the discussions here in this ESPAS conference, and I think the word strategic autonomy, I think, probably ranks third after foresight and future. I think, and I don't know, for colleagues who have followed the discussions for now 2 days, they might be sick and tired of having heard about strategic autonomy. But strategic autonomy is, I think, encapsulates a bit the zeitgeist of a Europe which is trying to address a very volatile, a very fragmented environment. We've seen how every crisis and developments over the past years actually have made the case for the Europe to get its act together and act in a more consistent way. So how much, if you take, Afghanistan, AUKUS, or what is happening at the borders of Belarus and Poland, you really show that, we are all together in the same boat as member states. So events are really a strong driver to get our acts together to strengthen our resilience, and the same way we've seen it with COVID, that our supply chain exposed our vulnerabilities. It's about this. It's also about, I would say, a greater understanding and a greater awareness, what I would call the genius of European political agency. What I mean by that we've seen how the ability of the EU and mostly of the Commission to address the long-term challenges come with these flagship initiatives on the green and digital transitions. We are trying to shape the future, irrespective of the dynamics of events. And I think this is where the EU is probably at its best. It's while trying to weather the storm of events, to continue and stay its course and address the big challenges and the mega trends. So the future of jobs, the demographics, mobility, all these elements I think are at the core of EU policies and should remain so. And to finish, I would just say that when we talk about strategic autonomy, we seem to be a bit uncertain about ourselves. I think we should realize that all the other actors around the world have no qualms about, talking about their self-reliance like they do in India, the Atmanirbhar Bharat, or the China dual circulation, or America's Make America Great Again in the first version, now the foreign policy for the middle class. Even we heard in a previous panel that Japan is thinking about its role and the necessity to assert its strategic autonomy and its strategic indispensability. So why Europe, we should be shy about it? And I think it's about also the way we see ourselves and we project ourselves. I think it's important to realize that in this world, many want us to take our role, to exert strategic responsibility. I will not go back into the discussion about strategic autonomy because they have been covered in other panels, but I think there is a lot that we can learn from this, and independent of whatever the future may bring, I think it's important that even the self-realization that we need to stay our course to address the key trends, at the same time be more resilient and able to address the geopolitics, I think it's what actually will make the Europe stronger.
Thank you very much. May I turn to Kristi and ask her to give us her take on what she's heard from Florence and her perspective on what Hervé has just said about Europe needing to take more of its own destiny in its hands. But I sometimes wonder whether this is actually what I'm not sure all member states necessarily share they may share the analysis. I'm not sure that they share the operational conclusion of what it means about how we organize ourselves. But please, Kristi.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to join the discussion, and thank you to Florence for this inspiring presentation and the paper. And one thing I would pick up from there is something you did not, I think, highlight in the presentation today, but it's this tightening geopolitical competition, which has been a trend for quite some time. And it has been kind of pushing the EU to change its narrative about what kind of actor it is or wants to be or aspires to be. And in the EU foreign policy research and also in the policy debates, we have focused a lot on the supposedly unique nature of EU power. But in recent years, there has been a shift. We have been talking about the geopolitical commission and about the need for the EU to learn the language of power. And that means the EU is kind of trying to take distance from this uniqueness. But at the same time, I see that there are still major shortages with the EU's ability to be a kind of great power in a traditional sense. And one of them is the weakness of political unity among member states and the kind of lack of resolve to act collectively. And the other one is shortages in the foreign policy toolbox, and especially the lack of hard power tools that is a weakness of the EU in the world where actually power politics and use of force has increased. And especially in the area of hard power, the EU lacks the capacity to be autonomous, and at the same time, it relies a lot on member states. And this is something where I think there's much more work to be done in the EU to build the collective trust and solidarity and commitment of member states to act through the EU. Because so far it is a political reality that for many member states, especially in the area of hard power, the EU is not the primary framework. And this is likely to remain so for I think, years to come. And even the tools that the EU has developed are often not used to their full potential. And the capabilities that member states have are kind of used through the EU to a limited extent. And this applies, of course, to military capabilities, but it also applies in the field of cyber, which is of increasing importance, and where, again, the EU relies a lot on the capabilities of member states and willingness of member states to act collectively through the EU. And furthermore, it's intelligence, another very sensitive area where there is a shortage of trust among member states to kind of cooperate more and to push for a more collective action, which of course would make Europe stronger, but the kind of structural limitations are also quite enduring.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very, very helpful intervention. I mean, I was kind of hinting at what you said when I asked the question of, is Europe equipped to face these challenges? Because exactly as you say, the more confrontational, the more transactional nature of geopolitics is not something which the EU is well equipped to participate in. We are children of multilateralism, and we were conceived in an era where the multilateral institutions played a vital role. They play less of a role, unfortunately, these days, and the raw hard power of individual countries, the big players, of course, America, China, Russia, and so forth, is much more influential than it has at any period, I think, in the past. And of course, we are not a country. We are a collection of countries. We have elements of federated power, some of them quite powerful, but we still have, exactly as you say, still a very strong autonomy for our member states, and still, I think, not a sufficiently common world view of our member states to have a joint response. That, I think, is your point about political will. On your point about hard power, I agree, though I do think the current competition is a bit less about traditional military power and more about economic and technological and commercial battles, which I think there the EU is actually quite well equipped and has we do a lot at European level. So maybe that is something which could potentially be a strength for us. But Ricardo, what's your take on all of this?
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone. I'm delighted to join ESPAS and also this distinguished panel, and most of you friends, and Kristi, it's a pleasure to see you too. I mean, if I can address some of the issues that are already been raised, and also on the questions that are asked, or the question that is asked in the panel, which is risks, opportunities, and choices. And so if I can go to risks and the way, I mean, one of the biggest risks that I see in this context is whether the EU and member states will have, the foresight, and we do have more foresight now, but do we have the foresight and the imagination to understand how the world is evolving? So, I mean, can we understand, or can we make sense of the trends and the weak signals and all the new issues, emerging issues that Florence speaks in her previous report and in this update? Are we able to make sense of this? But more than understanding how the world is evolving, are we able to act on it? And are we able also to shape that environment? So for me, that's probably a risk that I identify, and I think this then takes me to the opportunities and to the choices. In terms of the opportunities, I think the pandemic, as Florence also pointed out, has served to accelerate trends, to reveal vulnerabilities, also dependencies, but as also, I think, in a moment of make or break, the EU, I think, showed that it could make. And I think we have good examples from vaccine procurement, from Next Generation EU, where member states and the institutions together were able to show that they had the means, or at least the will, to address a systemic shock to the whole, I mean, or a shock that was a symmetric shock to all of them. So I think this shows that if there is, or I mean, in future situations, or as we prepare for the future, there are these mechanisms that we can use to potentially respond to this crisis. So this, I mean, the pandemic also allowed us to break some taboos, and so I think that is it's a relevant point. On the choices, I hear all of these discussions about strategic autonomy, and we abuse the word strategic, but being strategic means considering ends, ways, and means. And I don't think that sometimes in our discussions, we ended up, everything is a priority. and we seldom have a discussion or what are the issues. As the world is evolving, I published a paper recently on transitions. I would like to call them better the tango transitions, because they go together. Europe is in transition, the world is in transition, and so this world that is emerging, how are we going to be able to deal with it, and are we strategic enough to precisely ask these questions? Because when we are facing a world that is more fragmented, that is meshed, that is horizontal, our institutions are still 19, or okay, maybe not 19, but 20th century institutions. They are siloed, they are vertical, they are fragmented, and and not only the institutions, then it's the member states, and so we are in a sense we are in a fragmented and complex environment dealing with a world that in the meantime has changed. So the questions that I have are more about whether we will be able to make the difficult choices, because and like you were saying, David, and I'll end there. Are we picking our fights correctly? Is really geopolitics the area where the EU should invest resources and energy and time and political will? What are the areas where we can distinguish ourselves and that we are able actually to make a difference? I'm not saying that we should not be able to rescue our citizens when they are in a conflict situation or need to be rescued. Of course we need to be able to do that, or the EU should contribute to that effort. But are we to project power as a great power? We are years away from being able to match either, maybe collectively we'll be able to do that, but we know the difficulties that this will entail. So maybe it's better that we also have a discussion, and I know that we don't like very much to have inward conversations and discussions about institutions, but I think the way that the system today works is not fit for the world that we are awaiting. And so after a decade of undoing, this should be, the 2020s should be a decade of preparedness for 2030.
Thank you. I'm going to take some questions from the audience, if that's the right word. I was never entirely sure with online events whether audience is the right term. But anyway, the first one is for you, Florence. And I'll read the question because could you please clarify about China's projected population in 2066? The questioner says, it confused me, as it seems to have confused David O'Sullivan as well. So can you confirm whether we were confused or indeed what is the message of that? And by the way, what conclusions would you draw from that if there is going to be such a significant decline in China's population in what it will be a relatively short space of time?
Well, thank you. I think confusion should be part of the process because it means that we're holding conflicting information in our heads. So the source for this is the South China Morning Post, which shows that researchers previously have severely underestimated the pace of demographic decline. So that's a Chinese source. So I guess they would not exaggerate for nothing. The thing is that despite the lifting of the restrictions on the one-child policy, women are on average having 1.3 children per woman. And so that means that if you keep that together, that by 2066, China will be much smaller population-wise than today, effectively. As the confusion warranted, yes, that is a staggering number. It's about 45 years away. Now, the problem I have, or the question I have rather, is when we talk about demographics, there is this famous quote, demography is destiny. And I have an issue with that because, I said earlier, I also have an issue with the term explosion to describe Africa, because it seems to suggest that this is something negative and destructive. And, of course, behind that feeling is the idea that all of the Africans will come to Europe and invade us, et cetera, et cetera. I think what we really need to look further into, and we need more research on that, is what will demography actually mean? How will the balance of power shift? Will it shift at all? Will actually, in the past, demography is destiny meant the more people you had, the more people could serve in the army and the more people could work. But the labor market is changing and the military is changing. We now have AI, we have technology. That means that labor and even defense is no longer defined by actually manpower, women power. So the question that was asked from the audience, what that does mean, the answer is, I don't know. It just means that we have to ask ourselves, it also applies to us. Europe is going to have a smaller population. from 10, 20 years onwards than today. It will also be an older population. So there are all these questions coming up with it that I think ultimately it will mean redefining what demography means. What does the number of people mean for a state and its power? Does it perhaps even mean that power as such, as we said in the 2019 report, is changing, and it is no longer these classical ingredients like, size of the military, size of my economy, size of my population? Is perhaps state power defined differently in the future? We'll have to do more research on that.
Very interesting. Another question, which I'd like to give to Hervé and to Kristi, is will it take the EU to have its own defense capability to make it credible in a new international order?
The few times reference was made to a possible European army, it raised eyebrows in many quarters. I'd like to get back to actually in answering this question to the points made by Ricardo that and also Kristi. What are the true nature of European power? What we've seen is that in today's world politics and because of the increased interconnectedness between issues, that you need to have an approach to power which is more systemic. So the usual divide between soft power and hard power, as for me, is become increasingly blurred, if not irrelevant. The question is, indeed, the EU is maybe best wired to address some form of softer version, if I could put it that way, and it has to do with societal issues. But when it comes, push comes to shove, and the hard power, it's true that we are, I would say, at first glance, we are not well equipped. I mean, and the assets are with member states. So at the EU level, and probably not so well noticed, there's been at least a proposal put on the table, the so-called strategic compass, with the view to strengthen EU security and defense capability. That doesn't mean that we're going to have the full spectrum of capacity and forces available at hand and allowing the EU to act only on its own, but at least to be able to shoulder part of this so-called hard power and address security and defense challenges. So clearly on that, there is a lot of progress to be made, definitely. But if you think at also the nature of the threats, increasingly they are hybrid. They are not clear-cut. It was like Mark Leonard talk about the age of unpeace. It's not war, it's not peace, it's between. So how do we address and mobilize our toolbox to address these kind of challenges? It is, for me, one of the most relevant questions for the EU in the future. So drawing on all these instruments, technology, cyber security, it has to do very much as our regulatory environment as our capacity to push back on cyber attacks. So I think our ability and our agency to be able to mobilize all our tools is what at the end of the day will decide whether we are truly a power in the future, no longer in the sense of the traditional 19th century definition of what a power is, but one for the 21st century.
Interesting. And Kristi, I mean, you touched on this, but in dealing with this issue of defense, I'd just like to pick up on what Hervé said. I mean, the challenge for, I think, the European Union is not just to have the capabilities, and we know this about battle groups, and now there's talk about an intervention force and so on. But of course, the essential characteristic of a state is a monopoly on the deployment of force. And the ability to decide when to deploy force. The challenge, it seems to me, for the EU in trying to get into this area of hard power is how will you decide and who will decide how you would eventually deploy it. And I think that's been the problem, because the battle groups have been there for some time. We've sometimes wanted to send missions, but we've never used the battle groups. We've actually then made ad hoc arrangements for member states to contribute to military or civilian missions. So what's your perspective on this issue of can Europe only be credible if it has some kind of joint defense capability?
Well, first on this very important question of how the nature of power is changing. And of course it is changing, but the question is, does it change in ways that are somehow advantageous to the EU or rather not? We have been through a change during the post-Cold War era, when in Europe we tended to think that military power lost relevance, and it was, the ideal time for the EU to develop as a normative power and civilian power. Now we are in a different kind of world where military power is back. But of course, it's not in the same way as in the 19th century, but it is together with the new technology, together with the cyberspace, together with the AI. And all of that is kind of changing the way military power is used and the way in which it is relevant, but it is still relevant. And the geopolitical competition that we have been talking about, it's happening in many different arenas and spaces. So there is the military aspect of it, but there is also, very importantly, the contestation of norms and standards and values. And there is also the economic competition, where, as you have pointed out, that's the relative strength of the EU, and the technological space. So there are really many, many areas of it. And in some of them, the EU has a relative strength. In others, it is relatively weak. And we might kind of like to think that the EU should focus on its relative strengths, but that somehow, in my view, is not logical if we want the EU to be autonomous in future. Because at the moment, this talk about strategic autonomy, it's an aspiration. It's not a reality. And it's hard for me to see how the EU can truly be autonomous if it lacks some of the important elements of power. And for the time being, I think the only kind of reasonable way to look at Europe's credibility, I'm not even sure if that's a good concept, but to look at European security, I think we need to have a comprehensive view where we include the EU, we include the member states, but we also include NATO and the transatlantic relationship. And then we can get to something that actually kind of serves European security and can be kind of offering credible replies to the different threats that surround us.
Thank you. Ricardo, what do you make of that discussion?
I would go again to the point that I was making in terms of is it really on sort of hard power that we need to? Okay, I understand that we need to make some investment on hard power, but is this really the key element that will bring the EU to the next into the future? And I don't think it is. I think it's probably, I also don't like very much the expression of smart power. So it's more sort of idea of a blended power or meshed power, this ability to use many different let's say power tools, because as we've been having this discussion, the nature of power, as Florence was saying, has changed in the meantime over the past decades. So today, relationships, connections, technology, even values are part of this discussion. It's not only about armies, economic might, population, territory, all of these things. And this has also then an implication on threats. The threats also become like this. They become, we've seen this, I think a couple of last weeks, we have seen what the combination of different, let's say, threats, from energy to weaponizing migrants to building up military capabilities along the border of a country, what kind of complexity that this entails. And I think in this setting, as a foresight conference, we should really, even if I understand that we need to do this effort and that this is something, and I agree on the fundamentals why we're having this discussion about strategic autonomy, I think it's also very important for us to push back and to challenge our assumptions in these things. Because let me just give an example of Anatol Lieven. He's written this book about climate change. He says, so we are investing money in arms or in frigates to go to Asia, when in 20 and 50 or 60 years, all of these islands will be underwater. The islands that China is currently building. Are we really making the right choices today? Because our panel says it's tomorrow's world. It starts today. It's already happening, and the decisions that we're making are already relevant for that. So I would go again to try to push back a little bit on this idea.
Thank you. We just have a couple of minutes, and I want to give each of you the opportunity to come back. So I'm going to ask each of you to say a few, I won't say concluding words, but your sort of your final thoughts on the discussion, and I'll start with Florence.
I think people who know me will not be surprised to hear me say that one thing that worries me in our European conversation about the future is that we are predominantly scared of what's coming. And this is really the common thread pretty much around everything that we talk about, be it climate change, geopolitics, trade, etc. And you would be forgiven to think, yeah, that's just human. Humans are always scared. That's not true. When you look at surveys from Africa, from Asia, there are much more balanced views of the future. And I think that this is because something is changing, the world is changing, and we need to find our place in it. And so by definition, we go to the worst case scenario because that's, oddly enough, the most reassuring psychologically. But I think we're missing an opportunity. We're missing an opportunity to shape the future with more enthusiasm, with more imagination, to grab the challenges and turn it into something positive. And if anybody's out there listening, I would like to invite you to contribute to a more constructive conversation on the future of Europe and the world.
Okay, well, that's a very optimistic and upbeat note. Hervé.
Thanks, David. I actually had written three words listening to the different exchange. One was really about self-confidence, and I'd like to bring maybe the outside perspective. I think I find it quite telling. Sorry. I find it quite telling that when you are abroad and engaged with colleagues around the world, that actually they see us in a better light than we see ourselves. They rely on us more than we think we can even rely on ourselves. So this sense of self-confidence that we are not deprived of assets and strength is I think is maybe the first sort of mental and cognitive steps to make to be able to approach the future. The second element is resolve. And I think this idea of resolve is how we unite around goals we have, either in a way of changing the society, societal change is our model of society, and I think there is a lot we are bringing, but also resolve to push back when we are under threat. I think before we say, well, maybe we are too much of a whim, too much naive, I think there is a sense now we need to push back. So I think this is this realization that the future, and I probably will quote you on this, Florence, that the future is in our hands, as you like to say it, is very much there. And I think foresight, maybe, if it can bring and hone in on us that this is really what it's all about, I think could make already a greater, we could make a leap forward, I would say, in addressing, which is in the title of this session, for me, the key word is choices. It's really about our choices.
Kristi?
Thank you. Indeed, the EU has usually been good at self-criticism and not very good at self-confidence. But I believe there is also some reason for that. And we are seeing again in this panel how, just because of the mere fact of us sitting in different parts of Europe, different capitals, we do see the world around us a bit differently. We have different priorities and different threat perceptions. And I kind of sense that we don't quite agree on the relevance of hard power, including military power, and not denying that the kind of line between hard and soft has become blurred. And of course, we right now are seeing the kind of application of hybrid methods at the borders of the EU, which include different tools of influence. But perhaps to conclude, it's just important, in addition to looking to the future and looking to the kind of exciting, promising fields, also to recall some of the realities on the ground, for example, on the eastern borders of the EU, where the EU is faced with a kind of pretty classical power with geopolitical ambitions, with willingness to use military force, plus various hybrid methods. And we have seen the EU not being very firm or clear in communicating its responses. Then again, surprisingly strong and united in some of its responses, but kind of really searching for its power and the right way to deal with this kind of environment of geopolitical antagonism, which is something still relatively new for us when we think of the post-Cold War era, when the kind of international environment was so much more favorable for Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Ricardo.
I'll be very quick. I think, in the same way that Europe is grappling or struggling with the future, so are others. The US is also struggling with the future. China is also struggling with the future. Everywhere, countries and decision makers are struggling with the future. And I think, this is a moment of opportunity, the way I see it for the EU, whether we will be able to seize really this moment to build what we need to build to, in 2030, be prepared for a new world that we don't know yet how it's going to look like. So I would go, I think it's very important that whatever we do in all of the areas that Florence writes in her report, is that we keep the younger generations in mind. The decision-making processes nowadays are skewed to my generation or to other generations above me. We need to think much more and include much more the younger generations so that the decisions that we are starting to make do have a criteria of intergenerational fairness. I think this is very important, that we do not forget that we are leaving the world to someone else that would come after. And so let's also try to leave the world to them that is really the world that we would like to have been bestowed. And I think we have the possibility to do that. And I think, again, like I was saying, this is a decade of making, so let's do it.
Well, thank you all very much indeed. I will also try and end on the optimistic note, because I do think sometimes we see too many of the problems in Europe. When you actually look back, Europe is still one of the best places in the world to live. We have found the best balance between economic growth, social justice, regional disparities and so forth. And so we have many, many strengths. We have also many challenges, as we all know. I'd like to just finally pick up on Kristi's point, because I think it's very important that, where you sit gives you a different perspective. And I think one of the challenges we have in forging a European strategic vision is the need for a greater sense of understanding of the preoccupation of others. There's a natural tendency of each member state to look at it through their prism. If you're in the East, it's about Russia. If you're in the South, it's about North Africa, and so on. I think we need to be able to develop a greater sense of mutual solidarity, which is even if as a member state we don't have a particular stake in the issue, we show the solidarity with the member states which do. And I think it's only in that way we will build a common sense of purpose, because otherwise it will be 4 or 5 different views of what Europe's strategic interest really is. But look, thank you all very, very much indeed for contributing to a very rich discussion, which I'm sure will continue now for the rest of the conference. It's been a great personal pleasure for me to see how well ESPAS has grown and developed, and I wish it every success in the future. Thank you all very much.